Hi everyone, thank you all for coming. I'm very glad to be here. I'm almost done with my master's. My defense is gonna be in less than 4 weeks now, so uh, it's very rewarding to be in this stage of the course. My presentation, as you already know, it's assessing socioeconomic aspects of a state-based RED Plus program in Acre, Brazil and Amazon. Bem, first of all, what is RED Plus? Okay, RED Plus stands for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, plus promoting conservation, sustainable management of forests, and enhancement of carbon stocks. Officially, RED Plus is an international financial instrument to reward developing countries for their demonstrated results in mitigation um, greenhouse gas emissions from forests. Unofficially, RED Plus applies to any payment for ecosystem services scheme based on demonstrated results that focuses on mitigating greenhouse gas emissions from forests. Okay, who's going to pay, right? The idea is that the payers will be governments, NGOs, private companies, and individuals. Why are they going to pay? In the case of compliance markets like Quebec in Canada, like California, because you have to, right? You have a cap and trade program, you need to comply to this market. If you can't, you can offset the emissions that you could avoid, and then you can pay part of this supporting forest conservation in a tropical country. In the most common case, it's because you want to, right? In Acre, for example, there are some private projects. They are based on the United States, and they raise funds or create contact payers in the United States, mostly to pay these projects in Acre. So mostly based in individual conscience or corporate social responsibility, right? So there are basically three types of RED Plus. One, RED Plus was created to be a global mechanism, but as a global mechanism, it's not ready yet, right? The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change parties have been through a long and slow negotiation process, right? The idea of RED, for example, comes from the Kyoto Protocol, from the what's the acronym in English? It's Clean Development CDM. Yes. In Portuguese, it's MDL. CDM, exactly. And it's not ready, right? It's still in negotiation. It has been a long negotiation and a lot of controversial topics, and they're still talking about this. During all this period, small-scale projects proliferated in the tropical countries. Okay, it's estimated that 350 projects were implemented in the tropics from 2007 to 2018, right? And they're being very controversial, right? There's a lot of papers and a lot of criticism from NGOs about this kind of projects. And there are the jurisdictional approaches when national states or subnational entities, which means subnational state, a province, a municipality, a district, create their RED Plus program, and often they align this mechanism with their development priorities. Okay, most of the criticism on RED Plus small-scale pilot projects refer to the small-scale impact. It's a small project, the impact will be small, right? The possibility of leakage. Leakage is a phenomenon that happens when you conserve carbon, protect carbon in some area, but because of that project, you are creating deforestation somewhere else, right? So there's a leakage of carbon. And if the project is small, okay, it's very possible that it happens. The complex mechanisms and procedures, because especially indigenous peoples complained about the procedures, right? It's hard to comply. There's a lot of complex calculations. There's a lot of detailed accountability, and so it's difficult for traditional peoples to receive this money. So they're always dependent on NGOs or consultants to do that. The commodification of nature, and this is very applied to the indigenous peoples, that most of them consider that nature is sacred, and the Red Plus schemes, the carbon markets create this commodification, right, of the trees, of nature, of the forest, and it's not, it doesn't match with indigenous culture and traditions and beliefs. Another problem that was observed in projects, in Red Plus projects, was forced eviction of local populations, because of course humans are always affecting their environment, and if you want to keep a forest untouched, you need to remove people. So a lot of rural communities and forest-based communities and indigenous peoples were removed from areas because the NGO or the company wanted that area to be more preserved. Also, criminalization of traditional livelihoods, right? There's a lot of communities that are forest-based, but they have their livelihood sometimes causes livelihood sometimes causes some sort of deforestation or degradation, because they need to open field for farming, or they need to explore other areas of the region. So there's a criminalization of traditional livelihoods. There, one person that I interviewed in Acre that mentioned that the private projects in Acre had a problem with that, right? Because it was a private property with people inside that are not workers of the owner, and these people were living, and these people were smallholder farmers, and they were punished or pressured because they are affecting the environment, and it would affect the deforestation reduction results of the project. Land conflicts, right? Contentions between communities and within communities, right? Because my community receives money and your community doesn't. So it's a conflict, you know, and between the groups. There's conflicts inside the groups because, you know, if you are a leader, like I talked to some indigenous leaders, they're against Red Plus, but a lot of people in the group wants Red Plus. So there's a conflict inside because it's not a consensus, right? That this is going to be positive for them. And failure in providing socioeconomic benefits to locals. There was another person that interviewed in Acre that mentioned the private projects, and they said that the best benefit people had in this project was to receive a toothbrush. So that's what they got from the project, right? The owner got the money, but they got the owner of the land. The landowner got the money, but they got just toothbrushes. And centralization of forest governance and interference of external actors, often powerful actors, because if you have money, you have a lot of power to influence things. And yeah. Okay, so what's the advantages that jurisdiction approaches have? Because they work with broader territories, they work with all the territory of a state or of a nation, they can manage leakage, right? Because they are implementing a lot of different policies and strategies, and they can cause broader impacts, for example, right? Acre is a small state in Brazilian standards, but it's the size of Nepal or the size of the state of Georgia in the United States. So it's not a small state. So we can cause a lot of positive impacts if conservation can thrive. And because of the state leadership, a lot of other problems that we see in the private pilot projects can be addressed. For example, technical personnel to deal with procedures, right? If the indigenous associations have problems with complying with the procedures of donors, the state can assume the responsibility for that and then can distribute the money and benefit the indigenous groups. Alignment with socio-economic policies. So if there is a socio-economic policy, if there is policies addressed for indigenous people, for traditional communities, forest-based communities, they can, the state is able to manage all these conflicts and conflict management as well in the smaller universe, right? Between indigenous groups, between different associations of rubber chapters, for example, the state could do that. And also create a democratic governance to involve all the stakeholders, right? So involve the private sector, involve the indigenous groups, involve the non-indigenous traditional communities. Why I chose ACRI? Well, because ACRI is the first and most advanced subnational jurisdiction REDD+ in the world, right? They launched their program in 2010, and Brazil just launched the REDD+ federal strategy 6 years later. So ACRI was a very early mover, as they called it. And 2 decades of socio-environmental policies, right? That is substantiated in the idea of florestania, that means forest citizenship, right? Is the valuation of the forest-based livelihood, the forest origins of Acre, of the Acrean people, as a people that descended from rubber tappers and from indigenous people. So, and they need to preserve their traditional livelihoods as a means to preserve their culture, their identity as a state, as a people. And it still has, Acre still has 87% of forest cover. So it's a pretty good place to study REDD+, I thought. Okay, Acre chose a very complex framework for the REDD+ schemes, right? According to people I interviewed there, it was because they had they organized broad participation of stakeholders, and because of this, a lot of opinions arose, and then they decided not to create a REDD+ program, not to create a carbon program, but to create a environmental service incentives system. So they have 7 programs that was launched in the CISA Act. One of them is carbon sequestration, that is the ISA Carbono, that's the one I studied during the summer. And the other 6 are climate regulation, social biodiversity, water services, traditional culture and knowledge, soil improvement and conservation, and scenic beauty. Okay, the only one that has been implemented is carbon sequestration. Social biodiversity was launched in 2019, but it's not in operation yet. And the other 5, they're just in the paper. They're just in the CISA Act, but they don't exist in practical terms. Okay, my primary findings were the REDD+ program in Acre had indeed socio-environmental ambitions, right? The idea was to boost the already implemented socio-environmental policies, to support rubber tappers, to support indigenous communities, to finance state programs that benefited those people that wanted to develop the forest-based development in the state. They created a formally inclusive governance model, right? They have an indigenous technical chamber where they have 19 indigenous associations that can advise the implementation of the program and and the policies related to that. They have a gender chamber that I heard was something that UF influenced to create there. It was a fruit of a result of some workshops that were implemented there with Marianne and Wendy, and they have this chamber because they want that the gender perspective be included in that process of carbon emission reduction in agri. And they also include forest extractivists in the commission, the steering commission of the program, and in the gender as well. One of the people I interviewed was Robert Tapper-Ruhlman, and she was part of this commission. No trade of carbon credits so far, right? It was to be a market-based mechanism, but the market doesn't exist. Right? They're still deciding. California, for example, had a very important step in September. They approved the California legislator approved the tropical standard, the tropical forest standard. So this is like a framework that will regulate the future offsets of California, but California is still not allowed to trade with places out of the United States. Right? They can do offsets inside the United States, but not international offsets. So we still are in the same position that we had before September in this matter. And there's a lot of expectations in that this market will be available and open for this kind of operations. There's a high dependence of ACRI on international development donors. And I would say that it's Germany and the UK, right? They had Germany created a regional program in 2012 during the Rio Plus 20. And this program benefits Acre, Mato Grosso, another state in Brazil, Colombia, and Ecuador as nations, right? RAM is called Red Plus Early Movers, so the idea is to reward countries and subnational states that started early the process to create Red Plus schemes. And in 2017, the first phase was concluded, and the second phase was started. And now Germany is together with the UK financing the program. It's a $27.85 million program, right? So it's relatively limited funds. I mean, it's a lot of money, but for a state, it's not so much, especially because there's all the conflict, the daily conflict between development initiatives and conservation initiatives, and there are a lot of things to. So you can do some things with that amount of money, but it's not something that will cause a radical difference in the state, right? And as many of them told me, international partners have participated in ACRI development policies since the 90s, the 80s. And so, and World Bank has sorry, I forgot the words, has landed. World Bank has landed money in higher amounts of money to ACRI. So there are larger programs, larger initiatives that can cause much more impact than Red Plus in ACRI now. And what was really a real problem for me for our research, there is insufficient monitoring and reporting, right? We don't have enough information because the idea of Red Plus, the restriction Red Plus, is that when Germany calculates if ACRI is doing well, Germany and UK, they see that the deforestation in the state as a whole decreased, right? So they don't know if the initiatives that are financed with this money is actually causing any impact, good or bad, right? And it applies not only for deforestation, but also for social impacts as well. They don't know, right? If people their livelihoods are getting better, if they're applying what they are receiving. For example, there's a Very interesting program there that was financed with Red Plus funds. It calls Florestas Plantadas, that in Portuguese it means planted forests. So the government, the state government, plant rubber trees and fruit trees in areas of the agrarian reform settlements and extractive reserves. They don't have a report about this. They don't know if some families didn't use the trees, if they deforested the planted areas. They don't know anything about that. So it's very difficult to calculate if those initiatives are working or not. One interesting thing is that I interviewed some people at the Chico Mendes Extractive Reserve, and they had a lot of beautiful gardens of fruit trees, but they're not selling any of them. So they can eat, right? It's good for their food security, but they're not using for commercial purposes. Okay, so because I didn't have reports, reliable data to explore my research questions, objectives, this study relied a lot in interviews, in qualitative methods in interviews specifically. So I carried out 60-minute semi-structured interviews. They are mostly in person, but 3 were online using Skype. They were carried out between March and November 2019. I interviewed 43 people from 19 different organizations. Those people were based in Rio Branco, Acre, Chapuri, Acre, Rio de Janeiro, New York, and Sacramento, California. The profile of the participants. 14 forest extractivists, 4 indigenous leaders, 2 indigenous organizations. Indigenous, I don't know if everybody is familiar with the term. It's very common in Spanish and Portuguese. It means that organizations that are not formed by indigenous people, but they work with indigenous people, indigenous topics and rights, indigenous rights. So there are 2 indigenous organizations. One of them is very famous, and it's a Christian organization, Catholic organization. 1 independent socio-environmental activist, 1 federal servant, 9 policy managers that worked in previous state administrations, the Workers' Party administrations that that were very close to the socio-environmental movement. Indeed, there was before when Chico Mendes was leading those rubber tappers in Acre, he went to São Paulo to meet Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, that became the president of Brazil in 1202. And PT, the Workers' Party that Lula belonged to, the party was founded in Acre after Chico Mendes' assassination. But most of the companions of Chico Mendes, Marina Silva, Júlio Barbosa, and many of them, they joined Júlia Feitosa. They joined the Workers' Party in the 90s. So the Workers' Party has a historical relationship with the rubber tap movement and Acre. And in 1218, they lost the elections, they lost the government, they lost the Senate, and they had the most impressive defeat from Bolsonaro in all Brazilian states. Acre, Bolsonaro had in Acre 77% of votes. So it was the highest between all the Brazilian states. 4 policy managers that worked in both administrations, right? The PT administration, they're still working in Gladson Cameli's administration. And 2 policy managers that started in January, right? They're working for the current administration, and they joined the government only in 1219. 1 scientist from the University of Acre, 2 international NGOs. They are partners of the state government in the Red Plus scheme. 3 people from the private sector, 2 based in Acre and 1 based in New York. And 1 person from California Air Resources Board. That's the Californian agency responsible for the cap and trade program in the state. Okay, what were the socio-environmental aspects I observed? The first one that grabbed my attention was the benefit distribution. Indigenous territories have the highest rate of forest cover in Acre. They have around 98% of forest cover. But indigenous territories receive the smallest portion of the budget, right? I talked to people from the government and they told me that it was very reasonable because if you have a highly forested area, the pressures for deforestation are lower than other areas. So they don't require so much money to conserve because the forest is already there. If you have a deforested area, you need more investment and need to reforest some parts, and it's very complex. Uh, I think that explanation is very reasonable, but Red Plus in Acre and CISA in general, they don't have only conservation goals, they have development goals. And even though most of the indigenous people, the four indigenous people that I interviewed, the indigenous leaders that they lead big, large indigenous associations in Acre, they don't want to join this green economy that the government of Acre is trying to implement since the beginning of the PT administrations. They don't want to plant soy. They don't want to participate in any market, but they need money for managing their territories, reinforcing the security of their lands, to train indigenous teachers. They explained to me that it's a huge problem because they don't have indigenous teachers, so they don't want the Nawas, that is us, the non-indigenous people, the settlers, the colonizers, to teach their children. They want to have their own indigenous teachers, but they need money to train those people. So they want a lot of things. Among the four, only one was against red. The other three supported the initiative, but all the four recognize that they need funding, they need money to implement their policies, the territorial policies and plans. And okay, another thing that grabbed my attention is that the sustainable diversified livestock territories had 1/4 of the budget, right? And it's funny because I talked to someone that was involved in the formulation of CISA and NAPRI's Red Plus program, and he told me that the rancher doesn't need Red Plus, right? The rancher doesn't need it. The ranchers have money to hire a consultant, an expert, and they can prepare the project, and they can use the project in the carbon market. So it was very interesting to see why they have so much money for the livestock sector, but not so much for the indigenous territories. The third thing that grabbed my attention is that in the second phase of RAM, they put together the rubber tappers and the settlers. I mean, the settlers are the agrarian reform settlers, right? People from the smallholder farmers from the agrarian reform settlers. And the reason they put these two groups together is that in the first phase that was implemented between 2012 to 2017, they realized there are a lot of actions that was activities that were focused on each group overlapped, right? So they have a lot of overlap between initiatives. So they say they are very similar in production activities. So it makes sense to put the two groups together. But the thing that was really bothering me is that the extractive reserves extractive reserves have a high rate of forested cover, of forested areas. The most devastated of all is Chicumen's extractive reserve, and they have 94% of forest cover. It's very high. While the settlements, they have 58% of forest cover. So there are very different realities, right? They can be both smallholder farmers because a lot of rubber tappers are raising cattle now, but some of them are overcoming the limits established by the law, by the management plan, the extractive reserve management plan. But some of them are trying to to comply to these requirements. But even though they're smallholder farmers, their livelihood is much more sustainable for the forest than than in the settlements, right? The agrarian reform settlements. So it was something that I I was trying to explore, I was questioning. Okay, based on the interviews, I had uh, four main subjects that arose from the talks, right? Conflicts between communities and within communities were reported for three people, right? And it's especially a reality between indigenous people, indigenous communities, right? Insufficient participation of indigenous peoples in the decision-making process. It's very interesting because even people that support the Red Plus scheme, that praises the governance model, they say we need to participate more, right? And we need to participate more because for indigenous people, it's very hard to understand the terms and conditions of Red Plus schemes. Right? It's not only a problem of cosmovision, but specifically of language, right? The government had meetings with some leaders, but those leaders didn't know how to communicate those subjects to people, to people in the field. And the government doesn't have people that speaks indigenous language that can go to a village and talk to people and explain what's going on because it's very difficult. So there was a problem that was important not only for indigenous people, but people from the government and people from the civil society, that indigenous people should participate more, right? Because they don't have, maybe that's the reason why they have such a small participation, the benefit distribution, right? Also people, I mean, the majority, 28 people out of 43, mentioned fears regarding political context, right? And that was very important to me because I realized that the problem of deforestation in Acre now is much more political than economic now, in this moment. So you can provide a lot of financial incentives, but politics is a central issue now, right? People are worried about, there are some legislators in the federal arena in Brazil that wanted to change the limits of the borders of indigenous territories, something that many people thought was consolidated. Nobody was going to change that, but there are people talking about that. There's a lot of agribusiness-backed politicians saying that Brazil has too many conservation units and too many and too large indigenous lands, and we need to revise that. We need to see that because we need to produce, we need to feed people, and it's not going to work. And there's also some ideas to change the status of the Chico Mendes Extractive Reserve, that today is a conservation unit, is extractive reserve. And Chico Mendes will lose the status of conservation unit. It will be for sustainable use. So there's a lot of things going on, and people are worried about that. People are worried about their rights, about their land rights, about their cultural rights, socioeconomic rights. And by interviewing people from the government and from the partners, I saw an increasing influence of agri-environmentalist perspectives, right? I said that Acre had a tradition of social environmentalism. That's a movement that combined social justice, claims for social justice, and environmental claims during the 80s. And this social movement grew. They elected a governor, and a senator. Marina Silva was elected the youngest senator in the Brazilian history in 1994. And she was a rubber tapper, a former rubber tapper. And later she became the Minister of Environment. And now there's a lot of people mentioning things that are different from that perspective, that are more market-oriented, and they are more focused on agribusiness. One thing that I observe is that most of them think that the ranchers should become allies of the environmentalism and not adversaries. So there's a lot of trust in technology, in law enforcement, and market demands that the ranchers will comply to more sustainable ways to produce soy or raise cattle, right? There's a lot of trust in that. I felt that not only in the people from the government, even people that worked in the previous administrations, that is perfectly compatible to expand agribusiness in Acre and conserve the forest. And just this was something I think was very interesting to observe. So I had three main conclusions. First, okay, I only interviewed for three people, right? I cannot affirm the reality of the whole state, but among people I interviewed, I realized that in their case, the socioeconomic benefits were insufficient, right? In the case of rubber tappers, even they had the biggest program, the biggest sub program in terms of budget. The main benefit they received is the rubber subsidy that already existed before season. It was created by law in 1999. Now they are paid with funding from CISA, but it's not something new, some additional for them, right? And the flores plantadas, the people that I interviewed are not using that for economic purposes. So it's some sort of indifferent for them, right? If there's CISA or not, plus there's Red Plus or not for them, you know, they are not very effective. In the case of indigenous peoples, as I said before, I thought it was unfavorable for them because they have the highest contribution for the carbon stock conservation, but they had the smallest part of the benefits. And I also said, and I also observed risks that the increasing political influence of agribusiness harms Acre's goals of zero deforestation, right? Most of people interviewed said, no, we can expand agribusiness without cutting one tree, right? People believe that, but a very smart participant from the government, he said, no, you have to deforest, but will not deforest everything. Like, so there is a high risk that this new shift, in the economic policy in Acre will lead to more deforestation, even if it's not like a apocalyptic deforestation, but it can increase, right? And reduce this 84% of forest cover. And also co-opt the jurisdiction Red Plus scheme, right? They already have 1/4 of the budget. They really admire the Mato Grosso model, and Mato Grosso is another beneficiary of the Red Early Movers, the Red Plus program with Germany, and they really think they can conciliate, and that's the future, right? What people think is that forest-based development didn't promote the development they wanted to, they want to see, right? They invested a lot, but didn't work so much. So the state cannot rely on that only. They need to invest in productive activities, productive economy. So that's the reason why agribusiness can be, if it's sustainable, if it's based in forest, sorry, it's forest, it's very hard to translate the terms. I forgot the sistemas agropastoris is, yes, is a, yes, yeah, exactly. But there are three, pecuária, yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of trust. There's a lot of trust that this this model could be suitable and profitable for Acre, right? And that's it.